through Herda and Anthea for this invitation and for organizing this session. These Auxin sessions and the SOTL conference have been spaces that have challenged my own thinking and approach to my academic role, and have really helped me to develop a critical and theoretical lens to that approach. And CTL has done an excellent job of continuing this support flawlessly, even during the lockdown. So the title of my presentation today is Towards Humanizing Online Postgraduate Supervision, reflecting on student experiences during the lockdown. I'm sure there's some on this call who are just like me and feel that they could not possibly listen to another word about the lockdown, besides having to experience it firsthand with its accompanying personal, mental, and professional setbacks. We have attended multiple conversations, workshops, and conferences that reflect on the struggles of the lockdown. So why did I select this topic then? Well, I personally wanted to challenge the conception that our experiences during the lockdown are that much different from the old normal. There are multiple conversations about the new normal and how different our lives and academic roles will be once or if this pandemic is over. While it is true that there have been major shifts in the way we see and experience our world, there are things which have remained much the same. As we and our students continue to muddle through the COVID-19 swamp, we need to reflect on aspects of our experiences that reveal systemic, societal, and personal issues that have lain dormant for too long. We've successfully turned a blind eye to some rather obvious issues, and this presentation will reflect on some of these concerns for postgraduate supervision. So this presentation seeks to call us as postgraduate supervisors to critique and challenge our assumptions about supervision and our students, and seek to humanize the postgraduate supervision relationship, despite the fact that we are under immense pressure to graduate as many postgrad students as possible in as short a time as possible. Okay, thinking of postgraduate supervision as a relationship rather than a process allows us to begin to unpack our expectations, what we expect students to do or know or be when they embark on their postgraduate journeys. What I would like you to think about as I outline some of the expectations we have is, where do these expectations come from? What happens to students who fall short of our expectations for them at the start of their postgraduate journeys? Are particular kinds of students more likely to meet these expectations than others? And why is that? Where should they have acquired these skills, knowledge, and identities prior to the postgraduate journey? And what structures have been set up to support those students who may not meet our initial expectations in terms of skills, knowledge, and disciplinary identity? So in my presentation today, I'll start off by posing some reflective questions regarding our expectations as postgraduate supervisors. I will then zoom in on the supervisor's role, followed by a presentation of survey results from a postgraduate study. Finally, we will reflect on what these results mean for humanizing the postgraduate supervision relationship. Postgraduate supervision is a messy affair, and one of the issues is unmet expectations from both sides. It is even more difficult when these expectations have not been made explicit because we may not even be aware that we have them. When you first accept postgraduate students, you will most likely have expectations in terms of their skills. This could be their technical abilities regarding technology, specific equipment or tools, presentation skills, and so on. You may also have expectations about how well they can read and understand disciplinary texts and write academically. How about their research abilities? What do you expect them to be able to do right off the bat as they begin working on their proposals and planning their research studies? Is there any experience you expect them to have? What about their social skills and mental resilience as they embark on the unpredictable and difficult postgraduate journey? How about knowledge? What are your expectations in terms of foundational disciplinary knowledge and concepts and how well they can explain and apply these. Are there any disciplinary texts they should have read before starting their postgraduate journeys? What theories should they be able to apply to their studies right off the bat? And finally, what about identity? Who they are becoming in the discipline? Should they already see themselves as developing experts in the discipline? I contend that this is probably easier to achieve in some disciplines rather than others, especially in professional disciplines. Should they already have tapped into the disciplinary community prior to starting their postgraduate studies, maybe through attending seminars or workshops or even presenting at conferences? What networks should they already be a part of? And are there behaviors they should already exhibit which will identify them as developing experts in the discipline? I would like to take you back to the questions I posed earlier as you reflect on these three aspects: skills, knowledge, and identity, and your expectations about them. Think about why you have these expectations and the kinds of students who may not be able to meet them. Who are these students? And how can you open up access for them into postgraduate studies? The role of the postgraduate supervisor can be framed in any number of ways, each of them highlighting and emphasizing different aspects of what the supervisor needs to do in order to ensure the successful completion of postgraduate students. My framing here on this slide comes from the work of Lisa Willihan and James Paul G., both of whom wrote about learning in different undergraduate educational courses, but their ideas are important, I think, for postgraduate supervision. So postgraduate supervision is firstly about opening up access to what Willihan terms powerful knowledge. This kind of knowledge is principled and theoretical and provides us with lenses to see the world in different ways, and even more importantly, to imagine different worlds than the one we currently inhabit. So in other words, accessing powerful knowledge, according to Willihan, allows us to contribute to a critique of the world we currently live in or the status quo, and become contributors to the knowledge-making project that will challenge us to see a new world. Therefore, the supervisor's role in this first part is about finding ways to open up access to this powerful disciplinary knowledge that will allow students to challenge and contribute to the discipline's knowledge-making project. Of course, there are contentions in some disciplines that this powerful knowledge originates from the global north, as do the ways in which we come to know and apply this knowledge. I will not go into these arguments in this presentation, but I will acknowledge that these arguments are actually shifting the way we think about powerful disciplinary knowledge, what it is and how we come to know it. The second point is that we all have multiple identities which indicate our belonging to different communities. In the academic and personal space, we are teachers, or we are biologists, or we are parents, or we are friends, and each of these identities requires particular behaviors in order for us to be identified as such. These behaviors, according to G, are in the way we think, the way we interact, the things that we value, the way that we speak, even the way that we read or write, and even sometimes the way that we dress. We actually become accepted as members of a particular community and even viewed as experts because of the performance of these identities. In much the same way, postgraduate students, and especially at master's and doctoral level, have to learn these set of practices for the particular disciplinary identity that they are pursuing. The set of practices they engage in is viewed by expert members as a performance of the postgraduate identity, which is actually a gateway to the professional or disciplinary identity. This postgraduate identity is a prerequisite for them to be accepted as members of the knowledge community, which is the last point there. These practices are not necessarily straightforward and uncontested, of course, but they are agreed on by a group of experts. The sets of practices are obvious and implicit for expert members, but outsiders may find it difficult to decipher what they need to do and who they need to be in order to be accepted as expert members. The role of the supervisor then is to make these sets of practices explicit to students and also find ways of connecting them to the disciplinary community. It is important to note that the combination of these three aspects, that is access to powerful knowledge, developing a disciplinary identity, and becoming a member of a knowledge community, are what differentiates undergraduate from postgraduate education. Undergraduate education is about learning specific things or concepts and just getting them under your belt, so to speak. Postgraduate education, on the other hand, is about contributing knowledge, critiquing knowledge, becoming. It is identity work. In this part of the presentation, I'm actually going to look at the supervisor's role that I spoke about in the previous slide, and I'll use it to frame the results of a qualitative online survey that I administered at 3 South African universities. The survey was administered at different intervals in the second half of 2020, and the purpose of the survey was really to understand the role of technology in the supervision relationship during the lockdown. There were honors, masters, and PhD students from a range of faculties who responded to the survey. A total of 374 responses were received, 218 from the first university, 112 from the second university, and 44 from the third university. These responses provide insight into systemic and personal issues which have been aggravated by the pandemic. Issues which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, have actually existed, but we do not always consider them as important in the postgraduate supervision relationship. So in this slide, I'll look at responses that are related to opening up access to powerful knowledge for students. The first response points to the value of online research seminars, which provided the student with knowledge regarding aspects of the research process at the right time for the student to take the information on board and apply it to their study. The second response highlights the critical role of the faculty librarian, who was responsive to students during lockdown and provided them with what they needed in terms of literature for their studies. This second response is particularly important because there were multiple other responses to the survey where students lamented their struggles with accessing library resources. So in effect, this student was actually fortunate to be in an institution and in a faculty where the faculty librarian was as responsive as they were. So in some instances, the students in other universities had to resort to alternative sources or just wait out the lockdown in order to be able to access library resources. These first two responses show that there are other spaces within the university where students can access powerful knowledge, research seminars, reliable library access, and so on. However, this last response, which I'll show you now, is interesting because the student, towards the end of their response, feels that endless notes to sign up for seminars has actually not been helpful for them. The student would have preferred to have someone reach out to them and inquire about their mental health, a personal touch to show that someone cares for their well-being. This last response shows that the supervisor is indispensable in this access to knowledge process. Although I'm sure as supervisors, we may have found it easier to just send students off to the writing center or the library or other support unit so that we can get on with what we feel is the real job of supervising. But no matter how good the support from other spaces, the supervisor's personal touch is indispensable. In the second slide, I look at development of a disciplinary identity. Developing a disciplinary identity has to do with adopting a set of practices that build towards recognition as an expert in the discipline. As postgraduate students, one of the most important practices is actually developing an authoritative voice and expressing complex ideas clearly. And that's what the responses which will come up on this slide will show. I selected the first response because of the large number of other respondents who actually struggled to shift from face-to-face contact with their supervisors to communicating effectively via email. This student speaks about the challenge of expressing oneself via email, particularly when discussing a complex subject. However, for this student, there was an interesting shift as they were forced to really think about what they wanted to say. In other words, the difficulty in expressing themselves using the written word was the catalyst that pushed the student to write more clearly and learn to express themselves using the written word. The second student speaks about the supervisor's trust. I would urge you to just focus on the bold letters, otherwise there are too many words on this particular one. So the second student speaks about the supervisor's trust, that they would be able to work independently, and how that trust translated into the supervisor staying quiet and the students' uncertainty about whether they were on the right track and their worry about being an annoyance to the supervisor. Again, the issue of emails speaks to the struggle to write and express oneself clearly, and the worry that the writing will be judged in some way and that there's a permanent record actually of that writing. The last respondent on this slide worries that the supervisor has too much confidence in them, assuming that they have got it. And from the quotation marks that the respondent used, I would assume the student wonders what the it they were supposed to get actually refers to. So it seems the supervisor assumed the student had acquired the requisite set of practices and was well on their way to completing their studies. Clearly, the student did not share this opinion. Additionally, the online space, while it has become an important part of our professional identities, is actually stressful for this student, an aspect that may not be so obvious to the supervisor. Each of the three responses above point to important aspects about supporting the development of a disciplinary identity. Firstly, it is important for the supervisor to recognize the importance of writing and the identity struggles that take place in that space. Students know that their disciplinary identity, how well they perform the identity's practices, is actually demonstrated in their writing. Their expertise is judged in their written words, words that can be pulled out long after they've been written. Secondly, some students will find it easier than others to work independently and will more quickly pick up the sets of practices. So essentially, they require less support from the supervisor in developing this disciplinary identity. And lastly, there are definitely cultural issues that will come into play in terms of how the student develops their identity. And in the instances that are shown on this particular slide, specifically referring to how they communicate or how they struggle to communicate with the supervisor. While some will think nothing of reaching out to the supervisor when they encounter challenges, others will struggle to actually do so and will often wait for the supervisor to make the first move, so to speak. In this third slide, I look at the third item, which is becoming a member of a knowledge community. Performing the sorts of practices required of a particular disciplinary identity will open up membership to communities for the postgraduate student. Some disciplines are fortunate as these community memberships start within the department, where peers and other colleagues contribute to the postgraduate student's education. This is the case with the first respondent who's shown on the slide now. This respondent reflects on the helpfulness and encouragement of peers, which they really missed during the earlier levels of lockdown. They are also in a department where they can easily contact other staff for opinions and advice on their research studies, something which unfortunately has not been possible to do since the start of lockdown because of social distancing and because some people are working from home and they have to send emails to set up appointments and all of that. Membership also entails the ability to build relationships. And the second respondent points to the difficulty of building relationships using technology. Considering that technology will be part of who we are for the foreseeable future, a central part of how we actually build networks and contribute to communities. There needs to be support for this student to change their mindset and adapt to technology as a conduit for relationship building and becoming a member of their respective knowledge communities. The last respondent on this slide laments limited lab access, where they lost access to licensed software that they needed to work with their data. There was pressure from the supervisor to learn and use freeware and still produce the required results in a short period of time. I added this response here under knowledge community section for a couple of reasons. I mean, it can still apply to identity formation as well, but I added it here because the lab space is usually a vibrant and supportive environment where peers can work together and ask each other questions and therefore learn to use software or equipment faster. So during lockdown, when they had limited lab access, they were actually in a situation where they couldn't tap into this peer support in order to learn and use the particular software. The second reason why I added it here is because the learning of specific skills, in this instance software, is a critical aspect in order to be accepted as a member of a disciplinary community. And it is important for us as supervisors to recognize actually the effect of students knowing or not knowing how to do specific things as they learn to perform their disciplinary identities. Okay, this is actually my last slide. And in this slide, I'm just calling us back to reflect on what these results actually mean for humanizing postgraduate supervision, humanizing the supervisory role. I would argue that it has to do with the following, at least at a minimum. First of all, it is about acknowledging that supervision can be seen as more than just a process, okay? That an academic needs to complete for the sake of promotion and recognition, but it is about building a professional relationship with your postgraduate students. As academics, as supervisors, we have professional relationships with industry, with our colleagues, with people in other institutions, and so on. But it's said that there are a number of supervisors who do not want to see the supervision process as a relationship and feel they need to keep that distance. But I would argue, of course, different people will structure that in very different ways, but I would argue that it is important to actually see it as a relationship building process, first of all, in order to start humanizing it. So seeing supervision as a relationship building process is the first step in actually recognizing the humanness and individuality of our students, what they actually bring into the supervisory relationship. Each student will be different, even if they look the same, even if they come from the same place, even if they've gone to the same schools. Each one is bringing in a different set of skills, different set of knowledges, a different kind of identity. They have different expectations of the supervisory relationship and actually the postgraduate journey for that matter. And I think it is important as supervisors to recognize that. And when we recognize that, we'll start relating to each of our students at an individual level. This then leads into our reflection in terms of what we expect them to bring into the supervisory relationship and how we intend to support them in this regard. Of course, as we've done in this presentation, we need to reflect on why we have the expectations that we do and the kinds of students who are actually excluded as a result of our assumptions and our expectations. The next step is to acknowledge our role as that of opening up access to powerful knowledge and making the rules of the game more explicit for our students. The rules of the game here, I'm talking about the sets of practices that they need to acquire in order for them to develop particular identities that will be accepted in our knowledge communities. What we want is by the time our students finish their postgraduate studies, We want them to have a particular identity. We want them to have membership in particular communities, to have networked with particular colleagues, because as we know, as academics and as researchers, that is actually what builds our careers. So if they haven't reached a point where they're starting to at least build those networks and to at least be recognized as experts, even if they're just starting out, they're not full experts yet, but at least to be recognized as contributing in a particular knowledge community, then we know that you have placed them on a sure footing in order to move their careers forward. We then need to consider how to open up clear lines of communication and initiate conversations with our students openly and often. As I stated earlier on, it is easier for some students, and whether it's at undergraduate or postgraduate level, we have all seen it. It is easier for some students to be open, to ask questions, to critique, and so on in a public and private space. It's easy for some to drop you an email. Some will fish out your phone number from somewhere and you get messages and so on. But some will not. And it is important for the supervisor to actually make a deliberate effort to reach out to those students, because it may be something cultural that is holding them back. It may be something in their personality which is holding them back, or they may just be struggling with what we know in postgraduate studies as the imposter syndrome, where they really feel, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just a fraud, and I'm going to be found out soon enough. So if you don't actually reach out to them and acknowledge their contribution, acknowledge the work that they are doing or that they're sending to you, then you may lose students who would have actually made quite a substantial contribution to the field. And then the last point is it may not be possible in all disciplines. We have disciplines where they already have spaces and communities for students to work together. And you are fortunate if you are in disciplines that are already like that. I am in education, and there are certain groups and certain communities, but it's not something that is formal or standardized. So where possible, I would encourage supervisors to actually set up spaces for peer and other types of networks to start developing. And the purpose of these is so that students have a safe space where they can start performing their identities, where they can start adapting these sets of practices. They look at what their peers who are a year or two ahead of them are doing, how they are presenting, what they're saying, and they're picking up those practices, not just from you as a supervisor, but from those peers who are more experts than they are. Okay. And colleagues, that is the end of my presentation. These are my references, if you are interested in them. And thank you.
Thank you, Nompilo. That was very good. Will you just please go back to the slide with the blocks, 3 slides back, where you leave us with the takeaway message. And now I invite everybody to engage in conversation, ask a question. You can put up your hand or grab the mic or unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat function. So
I'll switch on my video. I forgot to switch it on earlier.
Yes, thanks. So we already see thank you and acknowledgement coming in the form of applause and notes, and that our colleagues find it very helpful. Thanks, Nompilo. So while we're waiting for questions, I've got one.
Okay, go ahead.
And that is about the relationship that you encourage us to establish. What is the boundary of that relationship? What can we broach and what can't we? What is in and what is out?
That is a very interesting question. And I could have given you a standard answer, but actually after this study, which I've just done, I presented like, I don't know, maybe 5% of what I actually have in the results. After that study, I would actually say it's a very difficult question to answer. Okay, so you'll find in the survey that I administered, quite a lot of students who've had a positive experience of supervision during the lockdown. There's one who actually said that for her, her studies were the least stressful because of her supervisor, were the least stressful thing. Oh, I'm assuming it's a her, sorry, were the least stressful of all of her life during the lockdown. And that was because of the supervisor. And this respondent talks about how the supervisor was available via email. The supervisor was available on WhatsApp. The supervisor was available on Skype. And the student indicates there, literally, the supervisor helped me not just with my studies, but also with mental health issues and directed me to people who could assist and so on. So in a crisis like we are now in the lockdown, it's actually difficult to place a boundary in terms of what the supervisor can and can't do. And I think this is a question that each supervisor needs to ask themselves and figure out, how far can I go? Because I'm also human and I'm also struggling in terms of the pandemic. How can I support my students better, but make sure that I set up boundaries so that I also don't lose myself in it and end up in a situation where I'm just supporting my students 24/7 and don't have anything left for myself and my family. So my answer to your question is, it's personal and it will depend on the supervisor. It will depend on the student. I have different relationships with each of my students and different kinds of support. Some have my WhatsApp number and some don't because of the kind of relationship that we have. I think what is important in each instance is to make sure that the student is able to come to you when they have issues. So if they've been quiet, reach out to them. And if students have got other issues that are not related to supervision and their work, even if they do come to you, you can point them to other spaces where they can actually get support. That's a diplomatic answer to your question.
Yes, and through the lines I read, more than we tend to think is inside the relationship. Thanks. And then we see a question from Dr. Saruchera about the feasibility, about actually we've got a big job already. So how practical is it to devote so much time to relationship building? And then a few comments below that, Dr. Saruchero also asked, how do we consciously balance out between ideal and progressive student supervision versus supervising it in a way that we were supervised when we were postgrad students?
Okay, so the first question, I'm just reading it now. Given challenges and multiple responsibilities, how practical is it to devote so much time to relationship building with several students, especially in the current times? Okay, as I said, this is something that is personal for the supervisor. We are as academics, we're in a situation where teaching is the most urgent of our roles, and it takes up most of our time. And it's something that we know we have to do. So we do it and life goes on. But when it comes to research and when it comes to supervision, it's something that we are trying to fit in because we know that we have to do it, but there isn't as much time to do it as we would like to see. Okay. And I don't think that the relationship building needs to take up a lot of time. Okay. I think just making sure that you stay in contact with your postgraduate supervisors is important. One thing that came out of the survey was the fact that some students really struggled with email because they had no idea whether their supervisors received their messages or not. So in some instances, they had to wait months and send through more messages to try and figure out, did the supervisor even receive my messages? I mean, it's small things like that. When you receive something from a student, send them back a message and say, I have received this. I'm going to be able to look at it in 2 weeks' time. So that's when I'm going to give you feedback. And that's what I mean by communicating. So keeping those lines of communication open and making sure that you manage expectations as well. And I think the what is it called, the MOU that Stellenbosch actually has and uses for supervisors is a really good starting point. When you're talking about relationship building, it's about making expectations explicit. from both sides, from both the supervisor and the student, and then also making sure you stick to your side of the bargain. So if you've said to the student, I need you to send me whatever you've written every month, even if you don't have a full chapter, even if you've only managed to write a page, and then I will attempt to give you feedback within 2 weeks or within 3 weeks. If I can't, I'll let you know. Then stick to your side of the bargain. That already helps the student to start trusting you and trusting your word. And we must also remember that you're probably the first person within your professional or disciplinary community. Well, let me not say probably, but in some instances, you may be the first one that your students have a relationship with. So the kind of relationship that they have with you will actually reflect on the relationships that they'll have with others. So if there's open communication and they know they can reach out to you and you will respond and keep your side of the bargain, that at least is a start. Okay, you said there was a second question.
Yes, at 1:20, Dr. Sarochera asked about a balance between how we know things could be ideally and how we were supervised. And I think this is a general question that we often consider in academic development. So I'm sure you can also cast it quite broadly, Nompilo. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually done a number of supervision courses and I've taught on some supervision courses. And this is something that worries a lot of supervisors. I was also worried about it. When I first started out supervising, soon after the PhD, I obviously supervised the way that I had been supervised. That seemed the ideal way to supervise for me. But as with teaching, I think it's the same thing as the way that we teach. As with teaching, you get to a point where you have to start reflecting on how you supervise and find what works for you. Okay, so I don't want to call it the ideal way because there is no one way. I supervise very differently from my colleagues. I'm in a center where there are 3 of us, and we all supervise and approach the supervision relationship very differently. It depends on our experience of supervision, it depends on our familiarity with the topic, but it also depends a lot on our personalities as well. And I think it's important for you to find your space, just like you found your niche and found your space and found your approach in terms of your teaching. You actually have to do the same for your supervision. And if you do that, it actually benefits both you and your students. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Any further questions, colleagues? You can type it or you can you can unmute yourself. Also, please, while you're considering your question, don't forget to complete the feedback form. I'm just reposting the one that, oh no, the one I posted was something else, sorry. Anyway, you're welcome to see what I just posted. Nompilo's recording will be available there at the Auxin resources in about a week's time. Any questions? I've got more. So, thanks, Nompilo. You mentioned a few times the anxiety that students have, postgrad students have, just with typing a simple email about where they're at or their work, so a personal or research work. So is there any way in which we can help them overcome that? Would you maybe, for instance, recommend that we clarify to them there are different ways of communicating for different functions? Or how do you deal with that anxiety of theirs in reaching out?
So as I said, one way is to actually reach out to them and find out from them, is everything going well? What is it that you're struggling with? But a lot of times those who really are struggling will actually not say anything to you. And which is why communities are extremely important in that regard. If you've got a small number of postgrad students, maybe 2 or 3, it may not be as effective, or it may actually still be effective. But you are free to contact others in your department or in your discipline and bring together your students. it works better when it's a smaller number. If they're over 20 or 30, then it becomes too bulky, and those who don't speak in terms of writing emails will not speak then. But if it's a smaller group and it's a supportive environment, and there are those who are louder and are able to express themselves, and they see, oh, others are actually facing the same challenges that I'm facing, that is actually a good step for them. That is actually a good thing for them to see, because it helps them realize that they're not alone. In some disciplines like the natural sciences and so on, as I had said before, they are at an advantage because they have research groups, and students already work together on particular research problems and so on. But in the social sciences and other such disciplines, the postgraduate journey is very lonely. So if you have a student who's struggling to reach out to the supervisor, and they really can't find a way to do that, then bringing together peers could actually be helpful to them. And if that still doesn't work, you can be very deliberate in terms of what happens during those peer sessions, and get them to do exercises or do whatever it is that gets them to say what it is that they are going through. So I found, anyway, my point is that I found bringing them together in terms of a community is actually quite helpful. They feel less lonely, and they recognize that there are others who are going through the same thing that they're going through. So it's not something that is new, it's not something that is unique. Everyone may be struggling to understand particular texts, or struggling with their writing, or struggling to understand their next step, and so on.
Thanks. That's quite helpful also to understand how we can make the communities work. So if a colleague has a question, let me know. Meanwhile, of course, I've got another one. Nompilo, you mentioned quite a lot the power of powerful knowledge, not just in knowing the secrets of the discipline, and I mean that in a powerful way, but also in changing the social status quo. And that is for us quite an important train of thought. How can we help them change social status quo? For instance, transformation at our university or in our industries from powerful knowledge.
Okay, that's actually not a straightforward question, because it depends on the discipline. It depends on the kind of research that takes place within that discipline. It depends on the conversations that take place within the discipline at disciplinary level. So there are some disciplines where conversations around transformation and social research takes place on a daily basis. But there are some disciplines where it's kind of frowned upon. And I found not all, but some professional disciplines are more like that. This is the way that things are done. The board has told us this is what it is, and we have to abide for that. If we abide with that, if we want to continue offering this particular degree. So if anyone wants to come in and wants to challenge, for example, psycha, it's sometimes frowned upon. So it depends. That is my answer to your question on the discipline, the kinds of conversations that take place there, the kind of research that takes place there. It also depends on the supervisor and how open they are to actually encouraging students to move in that direction. I mean, in some disciplines, you have people come in and they're given a topic. This is what you're going to study, and that's fine. But in other disciplines, students come in and they already have an idea of what they want to research. And it becomes the role of the supervisor to then guide that study and help the students develop that critical lens. So depends on the discipline. That's my short answer.
Thanks. I'm also just inviting more comments or questions. And then I would like to pick up from what you just said about it depends on the discipline. And you know, for instance, what powerful knowledge is and how we transform, or whether transformation is part of the discussion or the discourse. And then you mentioned the role of professional disciplines, for instance, the boards like SAICA. So from there, my next question, professional identity or disciplinary, sorry, you called it disciplinary identity. In some disciplines where we don't have it in a package, we don't have a set of graduate attributes like for SAICA. Or for EXA in engineering that describes what a good engineer would be when she hits industry. So many of us as supervisors are not very clear ourselves on a disciplinary identity. We might be it, we might live it. How can we find our way to clarity, or can we help postgrad students enter a disciplinary identity even if we don't have clarity ourselves on what it is?
Okay, earlier on when I actually explained the identity and becoming part of a community, I stressed the point that it's not something that is uncontested. So when a student chooses a supervisor, if they have the option to actually select a supervisor, they'll select a supervisor with particular ideas about particular topics. They could have gone to UCT, for example, and they decide to come to Stellenbosch because that particular supervisor kind of embodies what it is that they see or what it is that they understand should be what the discipline is talking about in terms of that particular topic. So in essence, when you are at supervisory level, especially if you have completed your PhD and you're supervising doctoral students, you've already made some kind of stand in terms of some main issue that maybe you're researching for your doctoral research or what you do in your postdoctoral research. So you've already laid a claim to a particular tribe. In each community, in each discipline, there are particular tribes under different topics who will have a particular side that they support in terms of the general arguments that are in the field. This is more common, of course, in the social sciences, where we will state that there isn't really any truth. We can't say this is what is true. It's how you support it. But the point is there are particular tribes that we as supervisors have aligned with. And in some instances, they may be small and they may still be developing. But in those small tribes, there are particular conversations that are already taking place. And those are the ones that we want to introduce our students to at first. They may, once they've started their studies and they've gone further along, especially at the PhD level, decide to start their own or align with different ones from the ones that we align with, and that's perfectly fine. But we've given them the tools in terms of how to network, how to become part of a community, and how to actually acquire the sets of practices that they need in order to be identified as part of that community. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. I think it's quite powerful the way you say that when you accept a postgrad student, if I hear you right, you're saying that student has already come to you because you embody the disciplinary identity that the student is interested in.
Yeah.
And you might not even have it explicated. You might not even, be able to name or frame it, but you will be able to introduce your student to the discourse of that tribe.
Yes.
Yeah. And if I hear you right, it's not a case of you may, but you should.
Yes, it's not something that is optional. It's something that is part of what you do as a supervisor. You have to introduce them to some community, which is why conferences are important, something that we missed out on in 2020, because they're really, really key in getting your students connected to people who will move their careers forward once they're done with their postgrad studies.
Thanks, that's quite important. Then if I look at the way colleagues responded to comments, I can see communities, and you just mentioned them again. Communities are an important part of our supervisory experience and of their postgrad experience. So I would just like to invite those who agreed on that point, Jody, Marianne, any comments from your side? And in fact, anybody on comments? we also saw another comment that was meaningful to colleagues. Cornell, when you said how difficult, when you quoted Prof. Leslie Swartz on how difficult it is for us to find time for research and postgrad outputs. And this is how, in relation to Nompilo's comment that teaching, and then actually we mean undergrad teaching, takes preference. So to some extent, we at the Center for Teaching and Learning are happy to hear that teaching is that important, but it remains that difficult juggling act. And it links very much to Dr. Saruchero's point on how do we actually find time for this? So that discussion is still not concluded. If you would like to comment on that, Nompilo, maybe?
Well, I actually attended, I was trying to find the page where I wrote the notes, because I attended Prof. Leslie Swartz's presentation not too long ago, a couple of days. How did he put it? All the university wants to do is right. All the university wants you to do is right. All the university is stopping you from doing is writing. So he was referring specifically to actually academic writing, but I think supervision fits in quite nicely here as well. And for me, I think it's about being deliberate in terms of how you divide your time. If you are in an untenable position where you're actually doing teaching right throughout the year and you don't have a break at any point, then you have a very difficult situation on your hands. But if you are in a situation where you have blocks of teaching, then make your postgraduate students aware of those blocks of teaching, and also carve out time outside of those teaching times specifically for more intensive supervisory engagement with your students. I have found with my writing, and I think also with my supervision, it's something that I try to do first thing in the morning. So when I start my day, before looking at emails or looking at administration and all of those other things, I start with those, even if it's an hour or two in the day. But doing a little bit of that every single day will actually help you to move forward in that regard. If you're not deliberate about that time, no one is going to actually give you that time. So if you know, if you're an early riser and at 5 a.m. or at 6 a.m. or even at 8 a.m. when you start your day, you start out with those aspects and you give yourself that time and you're very strict about that time. And then you go into the more urgent tasks, if I can call them that, then that will help you to move forward. Professor Leslie Swartz was actually talking about something he calls morning pages during that presentation that I'm referring to. And he says that's making sure that every single morning when you wake up, you spend that amount of time doing your writing. And I think the same goes for your supervision as well. If you have anything to give feedback on and so on, then you set aside that time and be deliberate about it. That's the important thing. Otherwise, the urgent admin and teaching will sweep you away. And then you get to the end of the year and you haven't actually met the objectives that you had said you're going to meet.
Thanks. And I see Marianne agrees with you. Marianne, do you want to state your point over the mic?
Yeah, thanks, Nompilo and Gerda. I think, you know, we become so busy that we think we're too busy to engage in conversation with our students. And we completely miss the boat and really undervalue, especially a new students and at specific points in time in their research process. If you know that the more you spend time with them engaging, the quicker they actually transition into independence. You know, they can continue on their own, and that is then what gives you the time later on. So, you know, it's the investment, particularly in the beginning, is we underrate it, undervalue that. You know, and then I love your second point that you made, to be strict with your time, because we allow our busyness to interfere with our plan. And yeah, if you can be strict with your time and block it out in your diary, there isn't any other way to do it. And use that time as you've blocked it out in your diary. Don't let it get taken up with other things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
valuable.
Thank you for highlighting that. And I just want to pick up on your important point that the more time that you spend with postgrad students, the sooner they will actually become independent. So in other words, the sooner they'll pick up the sets of practices that they need to learn and develop those identities that they need to develop in order to become recognized as experts in the discipline. Thank you for that.
Okay, so we see that it's more a matter of timing than of endless hard work, and that if you do it sooner, it will be easier. Thanks. I would like to invite you all to the next Auxin on 25 May at same time, 12:45, again on MS Teams. I'm trying to give you an idea of what it is about, but I'm really struggling with the format there. So it is about, sorry, let me find the words for it. Knowledge building through information skills, the way in which soft skills about information was introduced in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So yes, I will invite you all again. Lucy will help with that. Meanwhile, as Lucy has asked before, please complete the feedback form. And I think from all of us, we want to say thank you very much to Nompilo for helping us reflect on how we supervise postgrad students, some complex things that you managed to boil down to very practical advice, down to how we can manage our time wisely on this. And I think it was also quite moving for most of us to see the data that you could use to support the points. Thank you very much, Nompilo, for opening our minds to the humanizing part of students' experience in postgrad. That is the end of the session. Please complete our feedback form, and thanks a million, Nompilo, and also thank you. You can talk, yes.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation. It actually forced me to go back and start analyzing and writing about the data. So it would probably taken me longer. So I'm really grateful for this time that I had to share the results. Thank you.
Thanks. It was very meaningful. And thank you also, Anthea, for helping us with this Auxin. Much appreciated. Goodbye, Colin.
Thank you, Nompilo.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well done. Go well.